This is a podcast by the News Minute, and you are listening to South Central.
Hello and welcome to South Central, a TNM podcast where we put the South at the center. This is a show which comes every Friday. We are available on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting platforms. In this episode, we ask why Chief Election Commissioner Gyanesh Kumar is not responding to allegations, but instead resorting to political rhetoric. We also give you a sneak peek into Nidhi Suresh's story, where the nun who accused Bishop Franco of rape breaks her silence after years. I am Dhanya Rajendran, your host. Joining me in the studio is Pooja Prasanna, the reporting head of the News Minute and my co-host.
Hello, Dhanya. Should we first tell people why we missed last week? Because there were so many people writing to us asking why we missed an episode. You want to tell them?
I was unwell. People have written a lot of letters, dropped us messages. Some people have asked us what happened. Is there a court case against you all that you couldn't come? No such thing has happened. I was just unwell and too exhausted. Therefore, we took a break of a week. But I think we will never do that again. At least one of us should come on the show and host the show somehow.
But make of it what you will. Dhanya is not yet arrested. If that's what many people thought, she's safe and in the studio today.
Okay, so yes, we are back this week. And like I tell everybody, keep liking us on Spotify. After I made passionate appeals for 2 continuous weeks, it's moved from 80 to 87. No people. That's not enough. We need more people to go like on Spotify. My immediate competition is NL Hafta. I want to somehow be above Hafta first. So everybody, after you finish watching on YouTube, go to Spotify and like TNM's South Central. Now, our host, Leena Raghunath, who's been with us ever since South Central began, investigative journalist and lawyer. Unfortunately, sadly, this is the last time that Leena will be on the show as a co-host. She is actually getting off our train.
Yeah. Leena, why do you hate us so much?
This is going to be a huge miss joining both of you here. I know after moving back to Kerala, this has been a long distance relationship, but I've enjoyed each and every week being here and chatting about everything that matters in the South.
Okay, so officially, the reason is a very good one. Leena is joining Himal South Asian, one of my favorite portals. It's called Himal Mag. That's how you have to log in. It's called himalmag.com. She's joining them as a managing editor. I think we have discussed Himal's stories quite a lot. They were the ones who put out that fantastic investigative story a few months ago about how the Ambanis manage Vantara. So do check out Leena's work and Himal Mag's work. The unofficial reason is that she can no longer bear Pooja.
No, I am so sad, Leena, that you're abandoning me alone. I have to now deal with Dhanya. How can you do this to me?
I'm so sorry that, that I really couldn't even make it to the studio after I left Bangalore. But this has been so much fun, and I look forward to joining once in a while as a Himal representative to join you guys and talk on South Central.
Yeah, so we're going to miss you, Leena. You're always the lawyer on the panel.
And the same voice in the room.
So we have to get another lawyer perhaps, right? We're going to really miss you and keep coming back as a Himal representative.
As a panelist.
As a panelist, yes. Okay, so first we'll go to the headlines.
Yes. I have the doc ready this time. NCERT introduces Operation Sindoor modules in textbooks, includes Modi's quotes, Make in India plug. Nobody surprised. Amit Shah to move 3 bills for removal of Prime Minister, Chief Ministers, Ministers held on serious criminal charges. While we are discussing, I think it has been tabled.
And by the time the episode is out, maybe the bill will be passed also.
But I'll just quickly read out the names of the 3 bills that we're talking about. It's called the Constitution 130th Amendment Bill 2025, the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Amendment Bill of 2025, and the Government of Union Territories Amendment Bill of 2025. These are the 3 crucial bills.
So the Constitution Amendment Bill is being opposed vociferously by the opposition because it says that if a chief minister or a minister is jailed for 31 days, then they can be removed by the governor or the prime minister. So this is like a dagger dangling on the heads of all opposition chief ministers now. So I think in that case, Kejriwal would have been asked to step down if this amendment was there.
Given the dubious track record of all of our agencies, ED, IT, NIA, CBI, what have you, it will become very, very difficult if they get to decide who is in the Chief Minister's position. So, yeah.
But like I said, by the time the episode airs, this bill may already be passed. But since it's an amendment to the Constitution, it requires 50% in the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, and it requires 2/3 of those present. So we don't know if the government can come up with those numbers. I'm sure they can.
I'm pretty certain they can.
And the shock is they're not even asking for a conviction, right? You just have to be arrested to lose your right to continue. And that's very shocking.
Sanitation workers protest GCC temporarily halts privatization of solid waste management. Shabir has done a fantastic round report on this. We'll put the link. Go watch that video.
So basically, the GCC was supposed to privatize 2 last zones of Chennai. But now, because of the protests, though the protests have stopped after a Madras High Court order, the GCC is now saying that we will not have the privatization till the completion of the 2026 elections.
Yeah. Karnataka cabinet nod to internal quota, most backward groups merged with dominant communities. Now, this is being seen as a landmark move. The Karnataka cabinet has approved an internal reservation matrix dividing the existing 17% reservation for SC into 3 categories. The cabinet's decision is different from the recommendations of Justice Nag Mohan Das Commission, which had also been criticized quite a bit. And a quick update on what's happening in Dharmasthala. Virendra Hegde calls whistleblowers' allegation baseless. And in connected news, Parameshwara, who's the Home Minister, tells Assembly that FSL and chemical tests of soil and bones are awaited. This is the first time the Dharmadhikari of the Dharmasthala temple has spoken out. He gave an interview to PTI. And
no, but I want to add something here. I think a couple of Kannada news channels and a prominent English channel has been running this news that the whistleblower has gone back on a statement and that the whistleblower has said that he said all this on coercion of a group. Now, we have checked with SIT sources, we have checked with the whistleblower's lawyer, and even at the floor of the Assembly, the Home Minister himself said that this is being reported, but it is not true.
Yeah.
So as far as we know, the whistleblower has not gone back on any of his statements. Whether what he said is true or not is to be found by the SIT. But has he gone back? No. And I just want to ask all those people reporting that it's not a simple process anymore for a whistleblower in this case, for this man particularly, to go back on what he said. Because he has not merely made a police complaint or a statement to the police. He has gone and given a statement to the magistrate.
Yeah.
So now if he has to go back on the statement, then it has to go back to the magistrate again, which is an entire long process. So I don't know how people are just reporting that the whistleblower has taken back everything. Yes. And of course, some of the Kannada news channels are hell-bent now on saying that everything is false. See, look, this man may have been exaggerating, this man could have been false, but as journalists, I think what we should allow is for the investigation to take place. See, first we all asked the government, why are you not allowing an investigation? That was a legitimate question at that time. When the investigation began, we just follow what they did. And what did the Home Minister say in the floor of the Assembly? He said that this is a place with laterite soil. And it's a place next to a river. So all things corrode, including bones, which is why simply digging there may not help. And therefore, soil samples have been tested for have been sent for forensic and chemical analysis, and those have to come back. Because then those forensic and chemical analysis will tell if there is anything in the soil, including, after so many years, even bones you may not find, but teeth apparently may not corrode. You can get some other sort of DNA, which is what they are hoping. So while this is happening, there was an interview, I think, in Suvarna of a man who claims to be the whistleblower's friend, right?
Yeah. So he's trying to push the same narrative that Srinivas, who is the Gram Panchayat vice president, told me and several other people, that all of this might have not been illegally done, the burials that I'm talking about. So that's the narrative he's pushing, that yes, he was a part of people who were burying unknown dead bodies, but police were present, everybody was present. So there's nothing shady that happened. It's the narrative being pushed.
No, so I want to ask Suvarna, like, boss, what is your line? Are you saying the whistleblower is completely lying because the so-called friend that you brought forward is agreeing to the fact that the whistleblower was part of the Dharmasthala temple administrations, the people they had hired, and that they were also involved in burying bodies? The only difference, he's saying it is official the police
Correct.
were involved in this.
Correct.
Right?
That's what even the Gram Panchayat said. To my mind, this looks like a way of explaining away the 2 skeletons that have been found. That too saying that they were not illegal, because again, it opens up a can of worms, right? If there are 2, where are the others? But just a quick point, Dhanya, on the channels that you were talking about and the English channel that you didn't want to name. You know, this Hindu-phobic, all the people who are asking questions are Hindu-phobic, they're anti-Hindu. Who are the people who are also raising questions? Look at the people on the other side. Mahesh Timmarodi, Girish, all of them are people who've been part of pro-Hindu groups, right? And
no, I don't think it's not even them. It's the families of Saujanya
exactly,
and so many others.
Exactly.
Right.
So it is not a Hindu, Muslim, Christian problem. It's a problem of, did something happen? There are questions that have gone unanswered for decades, and people have every right to ask those questions. That's all it is.
Yeah, so do watch the interview which Shivani Kawa has done with the whistleblower. It's on our YouTube. In fact, I've been getting a lot of calls and messages from people saying Shivani Kaka has done a very good job. So we are making fun of Shivani in office, calling her Kaka. But her name is Shivani Kawa. Watch her interview. And on this note of being anti-Hindu, I think this week we are going to be in the cross hairs of Christian Catholic groups, because we have published a story. I mean, by the time this episode airs, we would have published a story by Nidhi Suresh. It's a long form story on the case against Bishop Franco, the rape case. This was the first time in India that the bishop was accused of rape, and it's the first time that the nun in the case has spoken out. She has never spoken through all these years, neither to English nor to Malayalam media, but Nidhi has spent weeks and months with her, and we have published a story. The second part of South Central, we will have Nidhi to discuss that story. So yeah, this is an anti-Catholic story. It's behind the paywall. Please do read it. It's on the homepage of the News Minute.
Kerala to declare 100% digital literacy, the grassroots campaign that left no one behind. This is a very interesting story we have put out. People should read it.
Yeah, so Chris has done the story about how from 14-year-old to 105, 110, how many ever old you are, the Kerala government, with the help of Kudumbashree and people on the ground, have been teaching people to be digital literate.
Right. Chief Minister Revant Reddy invokes NTR, appeals to Telugu parties to support Sudarshan Reddy. Now, he is the India Bloc candidate for the post of Vice President. Do read Power Trip that came out on Tuesday. We have inside scoop on how, despite trying to field a person from Andhra Pradesh, they have lost support of all Andhra parties, the India Bloc that is. If you're not a member, if you're not a subscriber, then become one and read Power Trip. Moving on to Andhra, former IAS officer alleges Pawan Kalyan misused Deputy Chief Minister office for gains from a movie.
Yeah, so this former IAS officer who also has a political outfit, he's moved the High Court saying that Pawan Kalyan is the Deputy Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, but despite that, he's heavily involved financially with this movie, Harihara Veeram Mallu, which I think released a few days or weeks ago, and that there were concessions given to this movie. The movie prices were hiked in theatres. So this former IAS officer has filed a case saying that how can a minister also have another, office of profit? And how is it that he is using the government to actually make sure that the film makes profits?
It's a conflict of interest, clearly. Yeah.
Okay, so that's it with the headlines. We now move to the first topic of discussion. It's about vote chori jaise galat shabdon ka prayog mat karo, media bandhuo. You must have all seen the press conference by the Chief Election Commissioner Gyanesh Kumar, who perhaps felt that everybody should understand really tough Hindi. And if they do not understand tough Hindi, they should suffer.
Yeah.
I have absolutely no clue why he held that press meet in Shuddha Hindi. But we are people who actually can understand Shuddha Hindi. So we've listened to it very carefully. And we're going to now talk about what the CEC said in the press meet, where he dismissed the charges and issued a 7-day ultimatum to Rahul Gandhi and everybody else who is casting any aspersions on the electoral roll and in the whole electoral process. But there are serious questions also to be looked at. Is the believability in the Election Commission of India at an all-time low? And if that is so, is that not dangerous? How is the special intensive revision of the SIR process in Bihar going? We have now seen that with the Supreme Court's intervention, the Election Commission of India has released the list of 65 lakh people who are deleted. But is that database properly accessible? Lots of questions. Joining us today is Supriya Sharma. She's the executive editor of Scroll, one of India's best investigative journalists. Supriya, thank you very much for joining us here on South Central.
Thanks for having me. Great to see all of you.
आपको हिंदी में बात करना है क्योंकि आप दिल्ली से हो. So let me tell you, when this press meet started on Sunday, we had our colleague Azifa on the desk. So Azifa is Duolingo Hindi. She calls herself Duolingo Hindi. So she panics because this press meet starts. Then she asks the Kerala Bureau reporter, Harita Manav, can you please come and help me? Harita Manav knows Hindi, just like any other Kerala. But she was stumped at Maddata. She's like, Annadata, something connected to that. And then they called up Anjana, who's from the Hyderabad Bureau, who finally sat and actually translated it. Though it sounds funny, it's not so, because you are cutting out a lot of people from understanding what is happening.
But Dhanya, even the questions that were asked in English were answered in Hindi and Shuddha Hindi. It seemed like a deliberate slap on the face for anyone who doesn't not just understand Hindi, but that level of Hindi, right? It's very exclusionary in that sense.
ऐसे सनसनी मत पैदा करो. Supriya, so let me ask you first, what are the Scroll has been reporting extensively on the Bihar, sir. You have done a lot of reporting, and I feel proud every time I read a Scroll story, and the next 2 days some national newspaper has followed it up. But what are your main findings till now from the whole process? And I know that more and more lists have been coming out. They keep revising the voter list. But what have the findings been till now?
हम आपके सवालों का जरूर गंभीर रूप से जवाब देंगे. Well, Dhanya, before I dive into what we are finding, I must tell you that I have been proven wrong on this story. I remember when the Election Commission first announced that it's going to do this special intensive revision of the Bihar electoral roll, I told my colleagues, no way, this won't happen. The court is going to intervene and stop this process. I mean, how can we have the third most populous state of the country with the lowest levels of literacy, with the least registered births? How can you have that state go through such a churn with just 4 or 5 months to go for the assembly election? So I was very confident that this exercise would be paused. The court would step in. And so for the initial few weeks, we really didn't do a lot. We didn't go to the ground. But I was, of course, proven wrong. And eventually last week, my colleagues, Ayush Tiwari and Aryan Mahata, they hit the ground. They went to Simanchal, which is Eastern Bihar. It's one of the most impoverished regions of Bihar. Before they went there, they did quite a lot of detailed data analysis. Basically, our focus, Dhanya, has been on exclusions. We're trying to understand who's getting left behind, because the fear around this exercise is that millions of voters are going to get disenfranchised and perhaps may also end up being labeled doubtful voters, which, as we have seen in Assam, is the starting step for the whole citizenship process to begin, and then for those people to be put through this NRC-like exercise where they're eventually even struck off and declared foreigners. So we've been focusing on exclusions. As I said, initially we did a detailed analysis of the draft voter list that came out, and we found that 55% of all excluded voters are women. Now, women form, again, nearly half the electorate. In fact, 47% of the electorate in Bihar is composed of women, and they're facing higher exclusion than men. In one district, we found that 70% of the excluded voters are women. Now, this is in keeping with the fear that women are going to find it hard to navigate this very bureaucratic exercise, also because a lot of women after marriage move away from their paternal home. And so it's going to be much harder for them to prove that, their parents were on the 2003 list. Many of them simply don't know which booth their parents have voted in and absolutely cannot even look up the list. The other fear all along has been that Muslims are going to be excluded in large numbers. On that, our data analysis proved to be a bit confusing. In the first round, we looked at exclusion rate in constituencies and districts. And when we did that exercise, we found that it's Muslim dominant districts and constituencies that are reporting high levels of exclusion. These are districts like Purnia, Kishanganj, Sitamarhi. We drilled down further. We used a program to determine the religious
identity of voters. This is a program that's in a repository in the Harvard University. And using that, what we found was startling. We found that it was actually Hindus who were being excluded disproportionately. For instance, take Araria district. It's one of the districts in Simanchal, the eastern region of Bihar, which borders Nepal on one side, Bengal on the other side. It's very close to the chicken neck. We found that in Araria, 57% of the population is Hindu, but 65% of the excluded voters are Hindu. Similarly, for Purnia and Kishanganj districts, we found that Hindu voters have been excluded between 6 and 9% over and above their share of the population. So when we did this data analysis, we were very, very curious about why this was happening. Why is it that with all the fears being that it's Muslims who are going to face exclusion, instead Hindus are being excluded much more? And this is a question that took Aryan and Ayush to Simanchal. They went to several booths. We made a list of the booths that have seen the highest levels of exclusion, where, the largest number of deleted voters. And there they found that many Hindu voters who are not on the list are actually not there in the village. They've migrated out, or they were just not able to trace them. But they found that in other booths where Muslims have been excluded in large numbers, the Muslim voters were right there. They actually met them. And it was absolutely baffling why they were not on the list, because many of them had submitted forms. Again, our focus has been exclusions, but in the lead up to exclusions, there's been a lot of reporting done by journalists from various news organizations looking at what was actually happening on the ground. It was that the BLOs were submitting forms often without actually having checked in with the voters. So because there was this deadline that had to be met, it was just being met in this completely, formal way. Voters didn't even know sometimes about this. And that's where actually, while we're talking about exclusions, this is just a partial picture. Right now, we know 65 lakh voters, people who were on the electoral roll previously, are not on this draft voter list. But this number could really go up, because all that's happened so far is forms have been submitted. The actual stage where much of this will be decided is document submission. This is just like a trailer that we are seeing. The final picture will be clear on September 30th. Right now, the BLOs are going around collecting documents. And that's where, again, all the ground reporting is showing that people are really clueless. So many voters, for instance, Santosh Singh of Indian Express has done a story where he spoke to voters who didn't even know that documents have to be submitted. They're just very happy that, our name is on the draft voter list. For them, that's where the matter ends, but it doesn't. And so the next few weeks are crucial. Over the next few weeks, BLOs have to collect these documents. And as we know, most voters don't possess these documents. So what the end result is going to be is pretty much on the lines that everyone, all civil society organization, everyone who's looking at this exercise has flagged that this could just lead to the disenfranchisement of millions of voters, millions of genuine Indian citizens who have voted in several elections, but could just be left out because of this really hastily cobbled together exercise, which frankly just doesn't make sense.
Those are a couple of points. One is that for those watching or listening and wondering that why are South Indians bothered about Bihar? Because we say South Central is to talk about South India, right? Because this exercise is coming here also. We're going to have elections in 2026 in Tamil Nadu and Kerala. And it's been said that the SIR process will be brought to all states. So what happens in Bihar is an example, a learning for everyone else.
Danya, but even the fact that there were several booths where my colleagues found that Hindu voters who've been excluded are actually not in the village. I don't think that necessarily we can conclude that those voters don't exist. Maybe they are migrant workers. Maybe they are in the south right now, working and have just not been able to come back for this exercise. I mean, this came out of the blue, and it's completely unfair to expect that people will drop everything that they're doing and sacrifice their livelihoods to come all the way back home to participate in this exercise. So again, this is just to say that we were able to do only a small sample of booths, but then we did find that just data analysis is not the answer. A lot more ground reporting needs to be done. But across the board, whoever has reported from the ground has found these really ridiculous instances of voters who are in the village yet are not on the list, or voters who've been declared dead. There's this very famous case, Mintu Paswan, man in his 40s, who has been declared dead. And he has actually shown up at the office of the Chief Electoral Officer in Patna and also been brought to the Supreme Court here. His case has, of course, been in headlines, but there are several such cases. And I think it's the fact that this exercise is being done in such a short time period is actually what really we should be questioning. That, and apart from the fact that, as many have pointed out, that it's essentially going to devolve into a citizenship test.
Yeah, that point was raised in that press conference. Why are you doing an SIR now, so close to the elections? Because clearly, whichever way you look at it, it's being shabbily done. And the answer was very unsatisfactory, I thought. He's giving the example of 2003 when it was done. But what he did not say was that in 2003, there were no elections in the next couple of months, though it was done in July of 2003. They had time to do a more thorough job, which is not the case now. And for me, the most prominent feature of this press conference, apart from the wonderful Hindi, is what remained unsaid, right? So many questions went unanswered. It was so high on political rhetoric. He's asking Rahul Gandhi to apologize, give an affidavit. Why was the same not asked of Anurag Thakur, a BJP MP, who made similar allegations, I think, just about a week or 10 days before Rahul Gandhi did. Of course, he was saying that Muslims are, names of Muslim voters are dubious. So that's one part of it. But the second part, while he kept saying that we are standing with the people, we are with the people, the fact that so many addresses, even here in Mahadevpura, we found, hashtag or zero in place of addresses. When this question was posed, he said that that's because many people don't have houses. They sleep on footpaths. So do they not have a right to vote? These are clear breaches of procedures and protocols that have been set in place. So instead of addressing that, he just gave half answers and ran away.
So, Supriya, they have been reporting reports from the south about how, there are 8 lakh Biharis living perhaps in Karnataka, and a lot of them are not aware. In fact, my colleagues Harita, Shabi spoke to representatives here, and they said that a lot of people have not traveled back to fill any of these forms, and they're not sure whether they are on the voter list or not. My question to you now is, the 65 lakh people who were deleted and their names have been put out now, those documents which apparently it's booth-wise. So it's going to be very difficult for people to actually sit and find out. But booth-wise data is out now. So let's say I'm a person whose vote has been deleted. Now, what is the procedure laid out? I have to go to the Election Commission office and give the documents and it will be added back?
Well, that's where, again, the Election Commission is doing something dubious. They're not taking complaints from voters who've been excluded from this draft list. Again, political workers or others who want to, sort of file a complaint on their behalf, their complaints are actually not being taken. Instead, the Election Commission is saying voters who've been excluded can sort of file their forms as Form 6. As we know, Form 6 is for new voters. If you've not ever been on the roll, if you're a young person, an 18-year-old who wants to vote for the first time, you file a Form 6. So they're asking voters who've been excluded to file Form 6, and they actually, on record, do not want to take a complaint. So they do not want to admit that they've made a mistake, to start with. The other thing, as you're saying, all of these lists of exclusion, they are being uploaded booth-wise. It's a complete nightmare. I mean, for anyone who wants to analyze this, it's almost impossible. Are we going to be downloading lists for 1 lakh booths? And actually that gets me to what was my favorite part of the Chief Election Commissioner's press conference. Pooja, apart from the Hindi and apart from everything else he said, I don't know if you noticed that he gave, again, a completely frivolous answer to the question about why not machine-readable lists. He said that that's to protect the privacy of hamari mataएं, बहनें, बेटियां. I mean, again, it really rankles that he's using this kind of language to describe women. We aren't just like mothers, daughters-in-law. Like we are individuals in our own right. And this is language that's been deployed by the Prime Minister time and again. And every time I hear it, it grates on my nerves. And it was just shocking to see that an official in a constitutional position was using that kind of language, and then completely dubious logic that it is to protect the privacy of women in particular, that they don't want to, make CCTV footage available, and machine readable list is also going to violate their privacy. That's quite, it's complete rubbish. In fact, someone who was uploading the data initially made a mistake. They actually uploaded machine readable list for Bihar, which is why we've been able to do this data analysis, because we downloaded the machine readable list as soon as they went up. And then days later, those machine readable lists were taken down, and instead they uploaded these scanned images. And when they uploaded these scan images, we quickly caught on to that and we did a story about it. We said that EC has replaced its machine readable voter list for Bihar with scanned images, which will make scrutiny harder. And within hours, the Election Commission puts out a fact check on our story and labels it false by saying that the voter list is still up. But we never said that the voter list is not up. We didn't say that the role has been replaced. We just said the format is different. And actually, it's actions like this that deepen the bad faith. When the Election Commission labels a factually accurate media report as fake news, that's what erodes its credibility.
Leena, you want to say something? Yeah.
Yes, this is one of the points that I wanted to bring up too. The way, the whole response of the ECI to all these kind of very shocking allegations, we can call it allegations with proofs that Rahul Gandhi had put out in his press conference, and now the whole of opposition unitedly is raising, is just to use emotional language, is to use very politicalized political language to just rather than as a duty-bound officer under the Constitution who's supposed to conduct free and ensure that there are free and fair elections, a constitutional duty that is the most important to ensure that we are living in a living democracy. And this man, and yes, this is not new, as we were earlier discussing. Rajiv Kumar, who used to recite Hindi poetry while giving press conferences, there has been a continuous fall of standards from the election commissioner that we have expected. But of all the constitutional politician posts that we see in this country, I think sort of a CEC role, because the judicially appointed officers of the president, they're all a step back when it comes to a public-facing job, right? But the CEC, when it comes to elections, when it comes that the government doesn't hold, this power, and when the elections are declared, that they have to take a step back, and it's the CEC who's ultimately, constitutionally bound to give us the next new government and the transition of power to ensure that happens in a way that the people, the voters, have the faith in that democracy. That process is being broken down, and we want this man to give us answers to all the doubts that are in the public's mind of why and how. And instead, this man comes with a mataye, bahu, betiya. Like, why? I was like, what is this? And to say that, that Rahul Gandhi is targeting voters by keeping a gun on the shoulders of the EC. Like, where does he come up with this kind of language? I was shocked. And at some point I was like, is he even reading what is he even understanding his notes before reading them out, to say that, the privacy is being violated if he gives us CCTV footages of bahu, betiya?
लगता है लीना को बहुत धक्का लगी प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस देखते
हुए। This is like double punishment for us. He's in the and Adya's in me.
No, but I just want to make two quick points. One is listening to Supriya on the 65 lakh voters, that that they've not made it very clear, as in if you're deleted from the list, what do you do? What is your way out? I just want to point out what happened in Karnataka. During 2023 elections, there was an attempt to delete 26,000 voters from this constituency called Shivaji Nagar. Then I think there were a lot of complaints, counter complaints. And finally, the list was brought down to 7,000. Out of which 21 people went to court saying that, look, we are here. I don't know why we are getting deleted. And the court gave relief only to 21 people. The rest of the 6,000 odd people got deleted. So the point is, out of 65 lakh people, if eventually the solution is going to be that you have to go approach court, how many will do it? So many people will get disenfranchised, like Supriya was saying. And one more thing I want to point out from Gyanesh Kumar's press conference, and even a statement which the Election Commission gave, was that they kept saying that political parties did not raise these complaints before or after election, while there is a window to raise a complaint before elections, and there is a 45-day window after results are out. Now, I want to point out to the CEC that in Kerala's Thrissur, the UDF and the LDF both gave complaints about ghost voters being stuffed into apartments in Thrissur. Basically, there's one apartment, there are multiple people registered in that apartment. They gave names of these ghost voters to the Election Commission in a written complaint much before the elections in Thrissur in 2024, and nothing was done. After the election, again a complaint was given. Then there was a probe by the Election Commission. The Election Commission then wrote back to the UDF and the LDF. We have got a copy of all those letters. In fact, Harita Manav, my colleague, has put out a story. Those letters say that everything has been solved. The whole thing has been studied by the BLO, and all those voters were legitimate, and all the other problems have been solved. Now, Harita Manav went to the 2025 revised list of Thrissur, the same booth number 30, and all these ghost voters are still on the list. So what is the CEC talking about? Here are political parties who raised a complaint before and after elections, and you have not acted on it. And see, we can only bring examples of 11 or 12 or 15, but who can then look at the larger picture, right?
Another point I thought he sidestepped was the whole point of this SIR process, or what they claim, was to also find out foreign illegal immigrants, as they claim. When that question was asked, he just sidestepped. Did you find Nepali or Bangladeshi citizens? You know, so the whole point of holding a press conference or even holding elections in a democracy is transparency, right? That's not optional. That's the whole point of it. And if he thinks that he can just reply in codes and some sort of a poetic language, then why hold a press conference at all in the first place?
Supriya, what I want to ask is that what is your general feeling? Is there a lot of, has faith eroded on the Election Commission of India? Now, as a journalist and citizen, I look at that process as a very, very dangerous one, right? Eventually, we should be trusting in our electoral process. Otherwise, every election we'll just be ending up asking this question, is everything rigged?
But Tanya, why is the onus always on us to say our elections are sacrosanct, even when there are clearly glaring lapses? Isn't that also part of democracy? Asking right questions, making sure that it is clean.
I've been a journalist for over 2 decades. I've covered 5 general elections, and never did I see the level of mistrust that I saw on the ground in the Lok Sabha, in the 2024 Lok Sabha election. I traveled in Western UP, where large sections of voters were very convinced that there wasn't any point voting because, well, whoever you vote for, the vote goes to Kamal or Lotus, the BJP. I mean, mistrust is very high among Dalit voters, among Muslim voters. And again, we're talking about the crisis of credibility that the Election Commission faces. Let's remember this not happened overnight. In fact, I went back to look at our coverage of the 2019 election, and I found a story where it said 10 reasons why public trust in the Election Commission stands eroded. Again, we tend to forget what happened in previous elections, but in 2019, this was when the BJP was campaigning on the basis of Balakot, of basically this claim that Indian fighter jets had crossed the border and struck terror camps in Pakistan, and the Prime Minister was going around saying "Ghus ghus ke mara" and vote for in honor of the soldiers. And this was a complete violation of the Model Code of Conduct. And yet the Election Commission did nothing. The Prime Minister also ended up saying that Rahul Gandhi has chosen to contest from Wayanad because that's a place with a large minority base. So it was again a communal comment, completely overlooked. Eventually, the Supreme Court had to step in, and it asked the Election Commission to take a decision on the complaints filed by the opposition. And that's when the commission gave a clean chit to Modi. And then it surfaced that one of the election commissioners, Ashok Lavasa, had actually dissented from the majority opinion. there were 3 election commissioners, the chief election commissioner and 2 other election commissioners. And one of them was, not only did he dissent, he pointed out, he went public, he gave an interview to Indian Express, and he said that his dissent was not recorded. So that happened during the 2019 election, and literally like 4 months after that, Ashok Lavasa's wife, son, and sister found themselves being, subjected to an income tax investigation. They were sent IT notices. Now, what is the message that's sent, right? And so 5 years later, what did we see in the 2024 election? We saw even more communal speech making by Modi and by Home Minister Amit Shah. I mean, it started with the Prime Minister saying that Congress is going to, snatch away the Mangal Sutra of Hindu women and redistribute wealth among. Initially, he said Ghuspetia. He used like these dog whistles for Muslims, but eventually he started very openly saying reservations will be taken away from SC, ST and given to Muslims, and I will not let that happen. Then it became, the theater of absurd with him saying that one of your buffaloes will be taken away. But the election commission did nothing. And towards the end of that election cycle, the chief election commissioner at that time, Rajiv Kumar, held a press conference. And my colleague Ayush Tiwari, nobody asked that question in the press conference. So Ayush had to go up to the chief election commissioner, Rajiv Kumar, and say, why was no action taken against Modi and Shah? And his answer was, we took a decision to spare the top 2 of every political party. Because people at high levels of political parties are also, they should take responsibility. So we spared like 2 people in Congress, by which he meant Rahul Gandhi and Priyanka Gandhi, and therefore we spared Modi and Shah. Again, completely absurd, no logical basis to that. So basically what I'm pointing out is that this crisis, where public trust is completely eroded, is not something that's happened because of one press conference or one omission, act of omission. It's happened because of fears of omissions by the election commission. The fact that election commission has been evasive when questions have been asked, even in the past, during the last Lok Sabha election, if you remember, there was a lot of debate about provisional turnout, final turnout. None of those questions were adequately answered. And every time there was rhetoric deployed, every time people who were asking questions were tarnished, the election commission made adverse remarks about ADR, Association for Democratic Reforms. Basically, they've been adversarial, not just towards the opposition, but towards anybody asking questions, whether that's journalists, civic society organizations, or ordinary citizens. And there's so many instances where there's video footage of things going wrong at polling booths. I remember during the last Lok Sabha election, we reported from places like Sambhal in UP, Bid in Maharashtra, where there was outright violence at booths. Voters were prevented from voting. In many of these places, these were Muslim voters. And those videos are there for all to see. In Sambhal, the UP police actually assaulted voters. And we recorded so many testimonies, even of women voters, saying that they weren't spared either. And the election commission completely ducked and did not take any action in those cases. So it's this kind of acts of omission and commission over the past few years. And not just the fact that, in these press conferences, the CECs are deploying poetry and political language that's kind of now making everybody ask whether this is a constitutional body that can be trusted.
Supriya, that was quite real time. Like you took us down a memory lane of all that was going wrong all these years and how progressively we have lost our faith in the democratic process completely. And to this, I would add the Supreme Court sitting forever on the electoral bond issue, and this big case of Chief Justice being removed from being along with the opposition leader and the PM, one party to the selection of the CEC. So all of those together has really eroded this process for all of us. Our faith is now, I think, at the lowest that it can ever be.
So I think this whole, like what Supriya is pointing out, that for so many years, this public trust has been eroding in the ECI, which has also made it easier for the Congress, I think, to exaggerate some of the claims.
Yeah.
Like the Mahadevpura claim itself, like what you were pointing out, and let me explain. If you look at the Mahadevpura constituency, it has 8 assembly segments, and 2 assembly segments saw the number of voters going up quite dramatically in a period of 4 or 5 years. In one segment, it was Congress that gained. In the other segment, it was the BJP. So we can't say for sure that, okay, the BJP is the only one which made a gain with an increase in voters. But same time, Rahul Gandhi can now make an exaggeration that there are this many fake voters. Well, we don't actually know if those people cast their votes or all of them are fake. But the trust is so low that a lot of people will buy that exaggeration too.
And that is directly on the EC, right, Tanya? Because there is literally no transparency for any question raised. And, everything is dismissed as fear-mongering. We are all called as conspiracy theorists if we ask questions. But it is your job to come and give a step-by-step answer so the people feel assured. Because look, it's already quite bad, especially in urban centers. The voter turnout is so bad year on year, right? It's dipping. At a time like this, when people feel it is futile to go out and vote, and the election commission behaves like this, and I feel like the sense on the ground is it's rigged from the time where the election commissioner, like Leena pointed, is appointed, then the campaigning, then after that, the voter rolls are compromised. After that, even the counting percentage is not given on time. So at every step, it feels very opaque. And I hope before Bihar elections, there is some course correction. They come out and give some answers.
I like your optimism.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest farce of election is how much money do people spend? I mean, some 25 lakhs.
This is a pet project for years now.
That's the biggest farce. 25 lakhs, 50 lakhs. People are spending like 50 crores per constituency and we have no inkling of that. Now, Supriya, my final question to you is that, keeping aside all the politics and whatever each party is saying, what do you feel are things that the Election Commission of India should address immediately? Because if this is a process that they want to emulate in other states also.
Well, I mean, it's a long list, Tanya. I'm not sure where to start. But again, to start with Rahul Gandhi's press conference, I would have really liked to see a point-by-point rebuttal by the Election Commission. Instead of the Election Commission putting out this tweet that they did within hours and asking Rahul Gandhi to make the allegations on an affidavit, a sworn affidavit, they could have just taken each of his claims and they could have given an answer to it. For instance, now there is a lot of attention on fake addresses, on, many voters living in one house. And I think that was one of the examples that was cited by Rahul Gandhi of like 80 voters living in one room in Mahadevpura. Now, I'm not sure what the story was in Mahadevpura, but for instance, in Bihar, we found, again, the draft voter list has lots of examples of people, large numbers of people, 400 voters sharing the same address. And that, on the first instance, looks kind of strange. In fact, Reporters Collective did a story where they found that 80,000 voters in 3 constituencies have been registered at wrong addresses. But when they went to the ground, the striking thing was that in one of the booths, where I think 459 voters were shown living in one house, one of the voters that they met actually produced the 2003 electoral roll, where all 459 voters had separate addresses, distinct addresses. So actually what this proves is that the Bihar exercise, instead of improving the quality of the roll, is making the roll much worse. Now, if the Election Commission were to give serious answers to each of these concerns being raised, those that were raised by Rahul Gandhi in the press conference, and all the concerns that are being raised in the process of, all the journalists who are going to Bihar and the kind of stories that we are finding, if it can explain why, for instance, it has these 0 addresses, if it can, provide answers in the way that you expect from a constitutional body, in a serious way, a response to a question that a journalist is asking, instead of labeling the report as fake news, right? So it's really hard to actually say, this is what the Election Commission must respond to. It's the attitude that must change. Instead of being adversarial towards questions, it should recognize that not only should it be impartial, it needs to be seen as impartial. And the starting point for that is to open itself up to questions and to answer them responsibly, which it's not doing at the moment. At this moment, it's basically deflecting, dismissing questions, And worse, labeling critics as, Pooja said, conspiracy theorists, using this kind of rhetoric. That's what needs to stop.
Okay, so Supriya believes that the Election Commission should not be adversarial to questions and that they must respond in a way that's befitting to a constitutional body. I really wonder if that will happen. I think the maximum we can ask for is at least some answers to come forth, because otherwise this does not augur well for India's democracy. And people are just going to, and I think for politicians also, this is a very dangerous trajectory to go. One Congress leader was telling me that from now on, any time that Congress loses, everybody is just going to say that, oh, it's because of electoral rolls. There's going to be so much of complacency within parties saying that, oh, BJP is winning only because of bad electoral rolls, or the EVM has been hacked.
So both sides, they'll not actually work.
Exactly. So it's very important, even for just politics, that this whole thing is sorted. And of course, for people like us. Thank you very much, Supriya, for joining us here and joining the Red Army. You, me and Leena.
I don't know why Pooja has decided not to join us, but
I didn't get the memo.
Pooja is a VIP now. She's a let me explain VIP now. So she doesn't do the dress code with us. Okay, so after the discussion on the CEC and this Shuddha Hindi press meet, we are going to talk about a story that we have published on the News Minute. It's going to be a short discussion, and then I'm going to read some letters that we have got over the weeks. We've never had time to read the letters, but today I think we will. So the next discussion, joining us is our colleague Nidhi Suresh. Again, she is in red. It's like the Red Army.
I'm the only one who didn't get the memo today.
Yes, or maybe we didn't want to tell you.
I'm okay wearing black.
Okay, anyway, so Nidhi, thank you very much for joining South Central.
Thank you.
So the story that we published on Friday, which is by the time this episode goes on air, it would have been published. It's called Against God's Men, a Nun, a Bishop and the Trial of the India's Catholic Church. So Nidhi spent many months to put the story together. Basically, this is a story where she tracks the life of the nun from Kerala's Kuruvilangada convent, who gave a complaint of rape against Bishop Franco, who was a very powerful bishop. He was the bishop of the Jalandhar diocese. He had to step down as the bishop. Of course, after a very controversial trial, he was acquitted in the case. But an acquittal really is not the end of the story. That is where Nidhi begins. So Nidhi tells you how this nun became a nun, about her childhood. Then she tells you a little bit about the case. And then she goes on in the story about what happened to that nun and what happened to the 5 nuns who stood with her. So for those who followed this story, it was not just about this one nun complaining. This actually witnessed a rebellion, a huge rebellion of sorts in Kerala, where we saw so many people, especially from the Christian community, coming together to support this nun that included 5 other nuns from her own convent. Sadly, after the 5, 3 of them have left nunhood now. So why did they leave nunhood? What is happening? How has the Catholic Church behaved abominably before the verdict and after the verdict? That's what Nidhi's story traces. It is a long story. How many words is it, Nidhi? 12,000?
Yeah, I think now it's about 12,000.
So Nidhi cannot now write anything below
less than 10,000. Yeah.
So it's a very long story. It is behind a paywall. You may ask why it's an important story. All stories are important. Some stories more than the other. 95% of our work is not even 95. I think 98% of our work is not behind a paywall. But some of these we do require you to pay and read. But Nidhi, there's going to be a longer conversation between me and Nidhi, which will be uploaded on YouTube in a day or two. But I thought that we should have this conversation because South Central has a different audience and I want them to go and read the story. Why did you decide, Nidhi, to go back to the nuns and find their story?
I think the interest came from also at a point where I was rethinking how to tell the story of sexual violence and that it never really ends when a verdict is given. That there's so much that goes on in terms of emotions, in terms of this understanding of justice and what the experience of justice is like for no matter what the verdict is. even if the verdict is for you or against you, there's so much that falls on the survivor or the victim's family after the verdict. And I was kind of curious to go back to trace what's been the life of this nun, even though the verdict had come in 2022. And there were reports about her being isolated, about the church not standing with her, and also the fact that the church never reinstated Franco Mullakal despite the acquittal. So these kind of questions really made me curious about what's happening in her life. And I think we had a conversation and figured that it was worth going back to really chronicle what it means to even fight for justice in not just one system. It's not just the court, but also within the system and the institution of the church. So I think that curiosity came from there, and that's why we decided to do it. Even though this is not typically a breaking news story or didn't have that kind of news peg that I think most newsrooms would immediately jump and want to do.
One would imagine, Nidhi, that the nuns would be angry, bitter. I don't want you to give away your story. We want people to go and read. But do tell me the sense you got, because you spent time with them, right? Doing your routine things, living life in its most mundane form. So what was the mood like? What were the conversations like?
To be very honest, once they decided that they wanted to talk, we actually spent a lot of time not talking about the case, which initially I kept thinking, when are we going to start actually reporting? When are we going to start talking about the case? And soon I realized that the reporting process has begun. And this is what the story is. The attempt to just move on, the attempt to keep staying in an institution, in a building where a crime happened, and to sort of reclaim that space, reclaim your voice, reclaim your position there, in a way that it makes sense to them in their life right now. And so a lot of time was spent really just in routine, in cooking food, in like doing the daily duties. And I kind of followed them. And eventually, of course, we sat down to talk about the case. But that was, and in the story also, we talk about how the violence is really just one flashpoint in their story at this length of how much time has passed. The violence is a central part. Everything happens around it, but there's layers of trauma and layers of violence that came from the court, from the church, from the people around them, from their own trusted friends. And the idea was to kind of capture that mood, which is also why I wanted in the story to have a photographer, because so much of it is visual, so much of it is to be experienced apart from the sensory idea of reading and seeing, but there's a visual element to this isolation. And that's why we had Isaac on the story to take pictures, and I hope that it kind of adds to that mood while reading it. So yeah, the mood was in moments honestly quite sweet and calm, but also you can't escape the fact that the violence that the building holds, and how they kind of are trying every single day to get past it. And conversations with each of them there's so much grief and pain, but you can also see collectively that they try very much to hold each other through this process of just engaging in the mundane, almost aggressively,
No, so I think one important point to note here is that the Catholic Church, before this case even went to court, did not properly respond to any of the letters which the nun kept writing, and that's chronicled properly in the story. And after the verdict comes, the first thing the church tries to do is to transfer them first out of the convent. When they say no, it's to basically cut off their stipend, it's to cut off everything that they have, and to squeeze their energy, their spirit, their hopes out, I think, and perhaps to drive them away. But there you see this, one group of people who come together to help these nuns. They're called Save Our Sisters. There's one more organization called SIS. All those people come together in so many different ways to just make sure that these nuns can go ahead with their life. Lena, you have read the story, right?
Yes, Danya. Yesterday night, while I was on a long drive in a car that was completely dark and I was squeezing my eyes, and on a drained phone battery, I was reading this long form. And I cannot put into words the emotions I went through as I read that story. I know you and we have been following this case, and I know you have consistently, Danya, made sure that this case was reported accurately and empathetically, and you have always stood by the justice. But to Nidhi and to you, I've to say that you have done I'm the best Me Too story I've ever read in anywhere in the world. And I hope and I pray that the story gets the due recognition, not just in India, but internationally, that the story deserves. Because Danya and Pooja, I know you guys have been television reports at the start of your career, and chasing headlines gives that adrenaline rush, and you're chasing one story after the other, big breaking news and all that. But I have, for the most part, spend my time in a long form room and trying to hone that long form journalism and what it means. Like, it's not the big breaking news we are following, but it's news that are culturally, that are politically important for maybe a decade or more, so that every reader can go back. And Nidhi, I know that this is a reporter's commitment to stay true to a story and its characters, and how much of reporting and patience and building trust in the character who's saying that story, opening up it, using you to say that story to a bigger world, right? So it is, I think, the best thing as a journalist that we can achieve, and you have done that with the story. And I just hope and pray this story receives recognition, because what we see is that big, powerful institution that has, when a woman, and the beauty is it that you have understood what role that faith plays in the survivor story and in the accused person story, right? How they use the same faith and the same God to justify what route they have chosen, and how beautifully. And it's also the story about this most powerful institution and about the men who stand in that institution, and to all the doors of justice that she had went knocking. And it's also that there are so many moments where I felt like, chills down my spine, that there is a room 20 in that story that I think all the audiences, there's a moment when it is in that room that will sort of, chill and shock you at that moment when you read it. But there's so many beautiful moments. It's journalism as an art when you say some of these stories, right? It's not a story for just this week or a month or a year. It's a story forever. I think the best Me Too story ever to be told. And I hope that this makes a change that is much necessary. And all those parts where the accused person talks about women, oh my God, I hope every one of you should go and read it and try to understand what some men think about women and feminist movement and rights and all of that. So the story is packed with each chapter. I hope, all of those who are listening to this podcast go and read this very important story, and it gets the recognition that it deserves.
As somebody who's not finished the story, and I'm hoping that by the time this is aired, I will finish it. I'm somewhere about 30-40%. One term that struck me, Nidhi, is where you've described that one of the nuns, I'm not going to give it away, says that her image of what she imagined her life as a nun or, church would be. You say gentle fatherly men, right? So my question to you is, after being let down by so many institutions, right? Legal and much before that, an institution they completely blindly trusted. How did their worldview change, if it did? Of course, there were a lot of people who were generous with their, money, spirit, support, everything later on. But to be let down by at so many levels, did it shift their worldview? And how did they view how others are viewing them too?
I think, to be very honest, I spoke to 4 of the nuns, and all of them who were involved have their own individual stories, which are equally strong. We, of course, in this story have had to focus on the survivor nun and her world, but each of them have undergone their own shifting and meandering ideas of faith, God and the world, right? And for a lot of them, they'd never known a court process. They never knew what it means to stand in court. They never knew what it means to speak their story. Even now, the survivor nun, who we refer to as Ruth in the story, always says that if she knew even what a 164 statement was, what an FIR was, she probably would do all of this very differently again, because the legal battle for them was the real time when they engaged with a world that was completely different. Because you have to remember, a lot of them, and definitely the 5 of them who 5 nuns, they all joined nunhood when they were very young. For very different reasons also. And some of them were quite candid about it. For example, one nun said that she joined because she just was a tomboy at home and did not want to live under her mother's strict rules. And someone had shown her a picture of Punjab, which had a lot of flowers, and she just wanted to travel there. And a father had come from there and said, you can come to Punjab if you want to be a nun. And she went and joined the Jalandhar diocese. And each of them had their own versions of why they wanted to join the church. So, of course, through this whole time, I think from what I understood, and every time I talk to, especially Sister Ruth, the survivor nun, about faith, it has now become a very private relationship for her with God. Because it's also a sense that, if now she doesn't want to share it with anyone, sharing her relationship with God, her faith with God is not something she talks about loudly. You can only observe it in the way she lives her everyday life. Every time I've asked her this question of how do you still decide to continue to do this within the institution? And she talks about protest. And she talks about standing her ground. And that's not where she started. She started from a very different place of fear, and she's made a journey to become resilient. But faith for her is not something she talks about loudly as much as she did. And this is something she herself says, right? So this is her. And each of them have had their own different ideas. Like some of them have stepped out of nunhood. There has been a loss of faith in the institution. But all of them still hold on to some idea of God, except for one nun who said that she still feels the anger of why this happened, despite her having this much faith in God. So it's very interesting to see. And I often at many points felt like I was not able to tell the full story, even with 12,000 words, because each of them had such a unique journey. And I just wanted to add one more thing to something Leena was saying, which was also that in many ways for a reporter, this is what you kind of hope for, right? That the person you're reporting on works with you in a collaborative way. And I don't think we can ever forget that in the months that I went back, it was also she who had to agree to kind of sit down and really relive this at a time when she's focused on moving on. So I feel like it also works only when the person you're reporting on is equally receptive to wanting the story told. It's a lot of time and work from their end as well to sit down and let me into that space and to trust in me. So yeah, and no doubts about Danya giving us the space to do this at a time when journalism is really going through an existential crisis. I don't think any other editor would have. I'll stop there, Danya. I have so much to say, but
no, as in I generally, when Nidhi first told me that she will try to speak to the nun, I've been in touch with them for a long time, not with the survivor nun, but the others in the group. So I kind of know them well. But I said, I don't know, I don't think she will talk. But it was Nidhi's perseverance. She has spoken to us so many times that there's something called winning over somebody's trust, right? And that happened. But the story is not just about the nun. Nidhi has also interviewed Franco, who thinks that is there need for women in this world if artificial intelligence is there. So you should read the story. It's pretty long. It will take you time, but it will well be worth your time because stories do not die with just a court verdict. And this is also our way of asking why has the appeal not come up in the High Court. The nun herself has approached the High Court with an appeal against the verdict, and the Kerala state also has. But till now, the appeal has not come up. So we are hoping that the story will create some sort of a dialogue again, and the appeal will come up in the High Court. Thank you, Nidhi. So everybody do read the story. It's on the homepage of the News Minute. It will soon be up on News Laundry also. So we're just going to quickly read through a few letters. Nidhi, you can also patiently listen to the letters, okay? So first, Chetan Bhaskar writes, "Hi TNM team, this week the South Central podcast was not on YouTube or the News Laundry app. Is there a legal issue or any kind of censorship? If yes, please open a fund. I can contribute to it. And if no, please put a short video on why the delay. Bhuvan was supposed to put a promo on why there is no South Central that week, but Bhuvan was so busy with work, with other work, that he couldn't.
I think we should put a picture of Bhuvan so people know whom to catch hold of when such things happen.
Bhuvan Malik.
Yes.
Please put his picture here, Jassim, while the edit is going on. This is the person to write to. But thank you, Chetan. Nothing like that happened. I was just unwell, down with fever and cold. And I was just too exhausted. And Nidhi was exhausting me. Therefore, I said no to South Central. Meera said, I hope you're okay. We were worried that South Central episode is missing. Take care. Thank you, Meera. Shrikanta writes, this is about previous episodes, okay? Special thanks to Pooja for highlighting Lal Bagh's flower show and for highlighting Old Bengaluru event.
Something that Danya had mocked me for on the show. Please note.
Yeah, I just said, how will you give a flower show as a recommendation? Will we put the Google map pin?
Let's get creative.
Okay. Then he says the speech by Adur Gopalakrishnan and his remarks on government funding for Dalit and tribal women producers. This was on episode 39. The incident reminded me of another case where Professor Ashish Nandi made similar remarks on corruption among the backward castes. The sad part for the self-proclaimed progressives is that Adur Gopalakrishnan has a track record for making sensible movies. I think we live in times that whatever is said and done seemingly in favor of historically marginalized groups. Okay, so it's a long letter. Basically, what he's saying is that some of these things are blown out of proportion. And he says, I wish people like Leena, me, etc. would grow beyond their prejudices to see remarks from accomplished people from an academic debate point wherever needed. I can speak for myself. I don't think this is the first time that Adur is being castist. And Adur has no problem when, I forgot, the National Film Development Council or whatever it is, they also give a lot of money to filmmakers. Till today, he has not questioned that. His movies also have been funded by that council. He has not questioned that. So I do have an issue with what Adur said. And yes, he has been cast as before. Dipankar writes, I'm an avid listener of South Central and found the discussions on Vijay to be disappointing. For much of the discussion, it was about whether you think Vijay doesn't have the stamina or not. And that was way too long, almost 40 minutes. I hope that more details would have been there which would have made it contextual, like what Vijay's caste equation is or what regions he has a hold of. Details like 1996 Rajinikanth could have made it not clear to someone like me who does not have the context of the situation. Okay, so he said it's a feedback, not criticism. Hopefully it will be taken in the right spirit. Dipankar, it's taken in the right spirit. I completely agree with you. I think all debates on Vijay have been very limited till now because I feel we still do not know what is the hold he has. Just saying stuff like women like him, children like him, young people like him, old people also like him. Are they going to vote for him? Which region is going to vote for him? Which demography is going to vote for him? I think nobody has answers, even in Tamil Nadu.
No, I just want to quickly add that stamina is very important in politics. If people think it's a breeze, it's not. It requires, especially when you're launching a party. So that is one factor that we need to look at. I think Rajinikanth, Kamal didn't make it because they didn't have the...
Look at DK Shivkumar's stamina. He's trying to ride a bicycle and he fell down. You saw that visual.
I don't know what is this new obsession with inaugurating on a bike, on a moped, cycle.
Okay, Kezia. I shall begin by commending you for fearlessly addressing the attacks on Christians in India, something that often gets swept under the rug, partly because Christians are by and large a silent majority in this country. As a Christian, I cannot tell you how many times I've been told to my face by my Hindu friends that you're a Christian, so you will convert us, and other such offhanded remarks, even though I keep my religious beliefs to myself. I would also like to add that Christians are at the receiving end of caste-based abuses as well, often being called rice bag converts because many of those people who converted to Christianity in India have been from the Dalit community. Moving on to the second half of that episode, we discussed Christianity and IT layoff. IT layoff discussion was also very interesting, but layoffs are nothing new here. The edtech industry has faced even worse, where people have yet to receive their severance packages. Most of us landed on our feet, and that is because EdTech allowed us to hone our skills instead of making robots out of us, unlike the IT sector. Oh, if IT does crash in India, it will indeed be difficult for thousands of employees. However, it will also pave the way for other industries to attract real talent that has been beaten down by the monotony of IT jobs. Okay, thank you, Kezia. I thought having Colin Gonzalez was really good in that episode because he's someone who's been representing some of these cases in the Supreme Court for many years. Now this is from someone who, remember in the last episode, we said that we are sitting closer together, me and Anisha.
Yeah.
And we asked, how is that? Because the chatter is more informal. So she wrote that, hi Danya and team, just to chip in, I do not like the new format. Bhuvan, don't take this seriously because we would prefer it to be that.
Bhuvan, is this you? Is this your alt ID?
She says it feels like overhearing a group kitty party chat. While the informality is light, why we wait for a week for an episode to drop and we are looking for more gravitas and info.
I don't know. Did the gravitas come down because we were
But that's
facing
everybody's
each other?
personal perspective, right?
Yeah, of course.
I'm sure this episode also people are going to feel that because we did a lot of Hindi mein bhashan. I mean, I understand what you're saying. Some episodes I personally feel they're too serious. So the other episode I try to balance it out.
Yeah.
But I think we'll keep that in mind. But I've never been to a kitty party. Never. No, this is not a kitty party
I've
at
been to
all.
a family kitty
Yeah,
party.
we do a lot of research and we come.
Yeah.
The informality, we'll try to tone it down if some people don't like it.
But also, it's not something we try to do deliberately. Sometimes the banter comes more naturally. Sometimes the topics is so serious that we...
And the worst part is a serious lawyer amongst us is not going to be there for next episode. Leena, therefore there's going to be more informality now, which is sad.
Can I say something to that?
Yes.
I think this kitty party thing was also a bit like derogatory because we're used to seeing men discuss things in a certain way, and just because it's different and a little bit like lighter doesn't make it kitty party-ish.
So the letter has come from a woman. So I'm feeling that maybe very less news.
Yeah, but we have a certain idea of what a serious discussion is, right?
Yeah.
And also the general assumption that kitty party only has flippant, frivolous conversations. That too, I mean.
Yeah.
We are not men. We don't talk about things that we don't know about.
Exactly. And we also don't take ourselves so seriously that, we have to appear stuffy.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we're fine.
Okay, so Suresh says it's about the Vijay podcast again. This particular podcast was different in the sense we had two panelists, that is Kavita and Shabir, who had different takes on Vijay's prospects. Also, they spoke without interrupting each other. That's the good part. The bad part is they missed the elephant in the room, which is the BJP. The role of BJP in Vijay taking the plunge, I believe that perceived potential ED rates would have been the tipping point in Vijay's foray. BJP's thinking would probably be any vote taken away from the DMK would be a win for them. It seems too simplistic. Even assuming Shabir's prediction of 10 to 15% fructifying, the moot point is whose votes will it be? I think it will be from AIDMK 60% and 40% from the DMK. But Suresh, we don't know. Like I said, it's just a guessing game now. That podcast was like Shabir was Vijay Anna will do well. Yeah. And Kavita's like, no way. Okay. So the next letter is from Badri. Badri says, I'm pleasantly surprised to note that the host of South Central considered my suggestion worth trying. This is a suggestion where he said that don't go topic by topic. Sometimes just have guests.
Yeah.
Invited Sucheta Dalal. I'm also thankful to have my name stated and credited on air. We are not like national media channels, TV channels who will take somebody else's story and then pretend like they have done the breaking news exclusive investigation.
Now.
Yeah. No, like there was one channel which actually said Dharmasthala impact. It's because of them that there is an SIT. Okay. Moreover, I found journalist Sucheta Dalal's views very insightful and educational. Specifically, her statement that the country is ill-served by all our political parties because not a single party has made this kind of business patronage ever an issue and the public does not seem to understand it. Okay, so continue the good work, says Badri. Thank you very much, Badri. Akash, I love this podcast and I have not missed a single episode till date. This is for Leena. I actually did not realize that this is for you, but it's good that it's for you because this will be your last episode as host. In episode 34, I just loved the 2-minute 30-second monologue by Leena Raghunath addressing the removal of secular and socialist. Oh, that's the one we were stunned, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And also low-key scared of Leena.
It resonates so well with the hypocrisy of the government. Based on the recommendation in News Laundry's Charcha, I read Annihilation of Caste by Ambedkar Garu and it blew my mind. Wish such books were part of education so people could understand the roots of caste. I also wanted to write in to appreciate the awesome work you guys are doing. However, couldn't make the time for it, but Leena ma'am's words made me put aside the work and write this email. I also request you to also bring in Sudipta Mondal on the podcast for his point of view. In today's Lashkar-e-Noida, he's the diamond in the dirt. Pooja ma'am brings the smiles and wonderful perspectives in this podcast, and I love her LME show.
Thank you.
Danya ma'am, looks like you are the glue that binds all this talent together and reminds me of a principal in a college.
You're absolutely right. In fact, like principals from 30, 40 years ago, sometimes she also beats us.
Sure. I used to have a scale, remember?
I do.
And somebody gifted me a lathi.
I'll tell you who that someone is. His name is Shabir Ahmed. He sits out of Chennai. So he gave her a lathi. He gave Tanya a lathi. We have hidden it away. She can't find it.
So he says, I am a News Minute subscriber. Now I have a joint subscription of News Minute and News Laundry. Thank you very much. And I hope more people like Akash become subscribers. Okay, so that's all from me on the letters. Do write to us at southcentral@thenewsminute.com. We do read all the letters. Sometimes I respond on email. Sometimes I respond in my mind, but I wouldn't have clicked send. But I am responding to everything in my mind. So do keep writing to us at southcentral@thenewsminute.com. Now on to recommendations, Pooja.
You are not allowed to beat me up, and there are a lot of haters in this room. My recommendation are 2 books and 1 movie. Rajnikant Life by Vasanthi Sundaram and Rajnikant The Definitive Biography by Naman Ramachandran. I would have bought those books. And also don't listen to people who are saying Coolie is not a nice movie. It's a wonderful movie, very entertaining. Go watch it. If you're looking for logic, go watch a documentary. This is a Rajni movie. It's great fun. So yeah, that's that. You're not allowed to comment on this.
So I'd highly recommend a book called Dapan, Tales from Kashmir's Conflict. It's a recently published book. Its author is Ipshita Chakravarti, my former colleague who joined Scroll a couple of years ago after having worked on the opinion pages in Indian Express. And we found very early on that she was very interested and well-informed on Kashmir. And she started writing Kashmir-related pieces. And I remember once there was a particular incident that happened where, if I remember correctly, a human rights organization was raided in Srinagar. And Ipshita wrote a report about it where she very accurately described where the office of the organization was located, how you get there by crossing a bridge, etc., etc. And we published the story, and then we found to our utter shock that she had never been to Srinagar. And yet she had been so precise in her description because she had read so much about the place, pored over perhaps maps, that we were like, okay, you need to go and report from the ground. I mean, if you can produce this report without ever having been to Srinagar, then you'll produce magic if you go there. And then she ended up reporting from Kashmir, outstanding stories, which we published over the years. And then in 2022, she dropped a bomb in office by resigning. And I was very upset. But then she told me that she's resigning because she needs to write a book on Kashmir. And so now the book is finally out, and it's a beautiful, lyrically written book. Ipshita is a fantastic writer, but it's not just the quality of writing for which I'm recommending this book, but the kind of stories that she has managed to surface. Again, we usually read about Kashmir in this slightly removed way, where we often don't hear the voices of Kashmiris. And Ipshita, despite not being Kashmiri herself, has very closely listened to the voices and beyond what is being said. So she's basically looked at the folk tales, the popular idioms that have gone around. She has recorded how Kashmiris tell the story of what's happened to them over the past 3 decades through the stories that they tell each other, the stories that are in the songs that are sung at weddings. So I'd highly recommend this book. Anyone who's interested in Kashmir, and even if you're not, please pick up this book, Dapan by Ipshita Chakravarti.
Leena?
Okay, my last show. So let me tell subscribers, listeners everywhere to keep supporting independent journalism, to keep tuning into South Central, and to back this great team. I'm going to another independent newsroom, and if you want to see the democracy function the way it wants, please keep supporting independent newsrooms and keep sending your money to News Minute and to the new place that I'm going to join, which is Himal. So I hope my recommendation is Himal, to just keep reading and into that.
No, you know who will miss Leena the most? Caravan. Because Leena's recommendations, 1 out of 2 would be a Caravan piece. But Leena, at least for next 2-3 episodes, I'll ask your recommendation and come to the show with it. Okay, I promise you. Nidhi, what is your recommendation?
I actually have been reading this fiction book called Museum of Innocence by Orhan Pamuk, which is a very long read, but beautifully written. And I would recommend it. It's based out of Istanbul, but such beautiful sentence construction.
You are actually recommending a Turkish author?
I am. Despite everything.
Yeah, I think I've also recommended one of Orhan Pamuk's books before. Yeah, you have.
You watch Turkish series. 1 second.
Yes, but after Operation Sindoor. Yes. Yeah, okay. So my recommendation is a podcast. It's a short podcast by the BBC. It's called In Our Time History. So there are lots of podcasts. The one I liked, the one I'm recommending now, it's called A Theory of the Leisure Class. So this is basically a podcast where 2 or 3 of the BBC journalists talk about things. So this is a podcast where they talk about Veblen's theory of leisure class. It's a very interesting podcast. Basically, leisure class are those people who buy things for leisure or possess things for leisure. It was written many years ago, decades ago in US. But I was thinking that Instagram and all these social media platforms, has it created a new leisure class? Perhaps even those people who cannot afford that leisure, but they are the leisure class who puts it out there, right? So maybe there'll be a new theory around that. It's a very nice podcast. Do listen to it. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to South Central. Keep the letters coming. Thank you to our producer, Bhuvan Malik. You know now how he looks like. Thank you to production assistant, Ajay. Thank you to Sukanya Shaji, who is listening to the show and, of course, sending messages in between, who makes sure that the story goes out, all the tweets are in place. Thank you, Sukanya, for all your work. And thanks to Yana, who does our social media. And Jasim Ali, the editor of the show, who will make sure that he puts out Bhuvan's picture this time. Thank you very much.